let's be clear firstly. Of course, in 1989 there was a sudden collapse of the communist regimes, as they were called in Eastern Europe. In Poland and Hungary, newly elected governments were created for the first time, parliamentary elected governments, in the middle of the summer in 1989. Around the same time, in East Germany, the population, or sections of the population, started to leave in large numbers. The flood of people, because Hungary, with its new parliamentary government, opened its borders to Austria, and large numbers of people left East Germany through Hungary for the West. And then they started leaving through Czechoslovakia, going to the West German embassy in Prague and asking to be taken into West Germany. And eventually, in a classically daft move from their own point of view, the East German government said people couldn't leave Czechoslovakia except through East Germany, and forced people to go by train from Prague through East Germany so that the East German government could formally expel them. And what then happened was that there were large demonstrations at the railway stations, and as these trains came through, with more people trying to get onto them, and pitched battles at the stations, and cheering of the people who were leaving, and so on and so on. And demonstrations started to happen in East Germany, in the streets, of people saying, we're not leaving. We are the people and we're staying. And these demonstrations grew and grew, larger and larger, and eventually the East German government fell. And of course, there's famous scenes of the opening of the Berlin Wall. That in turn inspired the movement in the streets in Czechoslovakia to a degree, because now, previous revolutions in Eastern Europe, or reform movements in Eastern Europe, had suffered from being isolated from each other. Now, things flowed over borders in the most extraordinary way. Czechoslovakia, street demonstrations grew and grew. Finally, one night in November, the Central Committee of the Czech Communist Party resigned, and a new government was formed, and the street demonstrations finally cheered Havel, the opposition's playwright, into the castle as the new president of Czechoslovakia, and elections were held and a new government was created. In Romania, in December, an official demonstration, called in fact by Nicolae Ceausescu, turned into a battle against his regime. There were street battles for several days. Finally, the Ceausescus were arrested and shot by the army, which had taken the side of the people in the streets in street battles with the Securitate. On Christmas Day 1989, presumably everybody remembers this, the Ceausescus were shown being shot by a military tribunal. Now, one of the things which is obviously significant about these events in Eastern Europe is that the regimes no longer had the practical support of the USSR. Because there is a significant question which needs to be asked about those events, which is, why did the regimes outside Romania, why did the regimes not shoot? Because they didn't. Why didn't they shoot to defend themselves? They didn't. Remember that June 1989 was the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. In fact, it was the same day as the elections in Poland. That Sunday was the same day as the elections in Poland. Why was there no Tiananmen Square in Eastern Europe? The one place that there was shooting, of course, was in Romania. But there the shooting was not simply the people against the state, but of course the state rapidly, within hours, split. The army, in fact, took the side of the people in the streets against the security forces, the security police, the Securitate. And it was partly because they were fighting with the Securitate that they shot Ceausescu. I think it was made clear, if you read the accounts of what happened in country after country, it was made clear by Gorbachev to the communist parties of Eastern Europe that there was a reverse version of what was known as the Sinatra doctrine. You do it your way, he said, basically. You're on your own. And there were reports, for example, from East Germany that the Russian commanders made it quite clear that they were not going to allow their troops to be used in any way at all to control popular demonstrations in the streets. What I think we have to say, as part of this story, is that the will to rule, in a sense, of the regimes was sapped. They didn't put up much of a fight. And what sapped their will to rule, what led to their fairly easy collapse in some ways, was the level of the crisis across the whole East European bloc, the economic crisis. And I think we need to go back and say something about the pattern of that crisis, because it wasn't the case that those economies were always in crisis of stagnation and inability to grow. If you go back 20, 30 years, when Khrushchev, as the head of the Russian government, the head of the Communist Party, went to speak at the United Nations, I think it was in 1959 or 1960, and took his shoe off and banged on the table and told the American delegation, "We will bury you," people didn't laugh. This was treated as quite a serious challenge. It didn't mean bury you militarily, he meant we're growing faster than you are. And they were. It was a shock to the Americans I think it was in 1957, when, of course, the Russians launched the first vehicle into space. Not the Americans, but the Russians. The Sputnik was, of course, a Russian scientific achievement, not an American one. The Americans entered into the space race as the followers, not the leaders initially. So we can't treat these economies as always having been stagnant. They became crisis-ridden and stagnant increasingly. One of the reasons, undoubtedly, is that the coercive model, if you like, of development which they had pursued became less and less effective, as in a sense as their economies grew closer to the world average. It was a mechanism for going from backwardness to a more advanced position, but then for further advance, the coercive pattern of organisation, this highly centralistic form of organisation, became an impediment to further development. Increasingly, because of the growing integration of the world economy, both in terms of production and in terms of trade and so on, their policy, which had been an autarkic policy, sealing off their economy from the rest of the world, became an impediment to further development. They began to lose the benefits of participation in the international division of labour. The giantism, which, as it was called sometimes, or gigantism, of their enterprises, the fact that their factories were very much bigger on average, more concentrated than the factories in the West, that they tended to have more workers working in large plants and much less in the way of middle-sized and small plants in Eastern Europe, also became an impediment to development, to adjustment, to the encouragement of new technology, innovation, and so on. And they were also affected, as all the countries in the world were, and Eastern Europe was not peculiar in this. They were affected by the fact that the whole world economy in the 1970s and 1980s slowed down, became more subject to crisis, that the world rate of profit declined in the 1970s and 1980s, and indeed the East European economies, as relatively backward parts of that world economy, experienced those difficulties more sharply. And of course, they experienced them more sharply in a particular way because in practice in the 1970s and 1980s they had become more linked up with the rest of the world economy. There was more trade, more cross-border investment, and so on in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, associated with that, there were rising debts. And the East European debts, particularly for Poland and Hungary, became major burdens on their economies. They were never on the scale of the Latin American debts, the great Latin American debts like Brazil or Mexico. But they were in that league, in a sense, as junior members of the members of the debt crisis league, if you like, unable to pay off their debts, unable to get their economies and their exports growing sufficiently to reduce their debt. The Polish debt, for example, grew all during the night, continued to grow all through the 1980s. I think it was something like $24 billion at the beginning, and it's something approaching 50 billion now. It's not actually quite 50 billion, but it doubled in the course of the 1980s. And nothing they did seemed to be able to solve it. The export capacity of those economies was poor. The quality of goods that they were offering on the world market was poor, not very competitive. Of course, that was not true across the whole range of everything that they produced. It wasn't the case that everything they produced was of poor quality. Nobody has ever complained about Kalashnikov rifles, for example, which are very high quality goods. But the problem was that their electronics and their cars and so on, there were an awful lot of jokes about larders. You remember the flurry, I think it was I remember during the ambulance workers' strike, it seemed to be the peak of larder jokes because the ambulance workers were going around cracking them perhaps. Of course, they all of them had a higher than average level of armaments burden on their economies, because they were smaller economies competing with, they were part of a bloc which of course was in military competition with the United States, and to compete militarily it cost them something like 2 or 3 times the proportion of their gross national product that the Americans were spending. So this was a further drain on their economic capacity, keeping up in a sense with the Americans. And so you see in the 1980s, as these economies become more and more arthritic, more and more tending towards stagnation, more and more stagnant and debt-laden, that the living standards of the population, which had grown in the 1950s and 1960s, although unevenly they had grown, tended to stagnate and to fall. And the comparisons, because they were more open now to information, for example, from the West, there were more diverse sources of media and information flows of one sort or another. People could make more easily comparisons between their situation and the situation of people in the West. Those comparisons became sharper and sharper. And simultaneously, the costs to the population of that form of economic organization became more apparent. The costs in terms of pollution, for example, became more and more apparent. The health costs to the population. There's some stunning figures in a book edited by Roger Clark, which you'll find on the reading list, called The Polish Economy in the 1980s, which in fact covers more than the Polish economy. There's an essay in there by a demographer, a student of population trends, who shows that the life expectancy of males, this is restricted to males, the life expectancy of males in Poland fell from the mid-1960s onwards. And he also shows that this was true in Hungary and in the USSR. You see, these countries which had boasted in the past, and on the basis of real achievements, that they in fact had superior health services and so on, actually were no longer able to make that claim. Whereas in Japan, for example, the life expectancy in the 1980s rocketed upwards. In Poland and Hungary, and they're the countries, and Russia, they're the countries which gives figures, declined. It should have declined in Romania, for example. And the basic reason was a collapse of the infrastructure of the health services, because they were underinvested in, there were medicine shortages and so on, and because of the pollution. Because the pollution was now becoming a serious threat to health. There were babies in one area in Czechoslovakia, for example, an industrial area. People taking babies out of hospital had to sign a document saying that they would not give their babies tap water for the first year as a condition for being allowed to take the baby out of hospital, because the water wasn't safe for babies, because of the level of chemicals in it, and so on. Now, given these sorts of economic problems, these are not simply that the opposition talked about these problems, increasingly the regimes themselves talked about the problems. It was remarked by Solidarity intellectuals in the 1980s that it used to be the case, they said, that we were the source of truth and the regime was the source of lies. It is no longer true, said Fura. The regime tells the truth, basically, about society today. You can read the official newspapers. We don't need an underground opposition press, in one sense, to inform the population about the reality of the situation, because the regime is blasting its own system. They are publishing the details about the problems with the ecology of Poland, the levels of pollution, the unavailability of medicines, the problems with the non-growth of the economy and so on. You can read it in the official press. And they began, the rulers of these countries, and we possibly need to make a distinction between the people who are the rulers in the sense of forming the government and the ruling class, or whatever you want to call them. I mean, you may not like, I don't care about it at this point in time, at this moment in the argument, about what language we're going to use to describe this. Those people who head up industry, who head up the major enterprises and branches of the state, the judiciary, the police, the army, the economic ministries, the heads of enterprises and so on. The people in the West we would think of, if you want to use that language, of constitutional ruling class. Those people began increasingly to look for alternatives in the 1980s. They looked at projects for reform and restructuring. Some of them in the enterprise, some enterprises tried to form, some of them successfully, tried to form links with multinational companies, Western multinational companies. You know, licensing agreements to manufacture Western products inside Poland, for example, or Czechoslovakia or Russia. This was quite a long-term tendency. I mean, Fiat had built factories in Togliattigrad, I think it was in the 1960s, manufacturing second-hand models of Fiats for the Russian market. There grew increasingly to be a tide of opinion in ruling circles, of admiration for the market, for the relative success of the Western European countries by comparison with what was seen increasingly as the failures of the East European countries. Indeed, it was admiration for people like Mrs. Thatcher. Jaruzelski, for example, the communist president of Poland, after the defeat of the miners' strike by the Thatcher government, basically made a statement saying, that's what we'd like to be able to do. Mrs. Thatcher we have to admire Mrs. Thatcher, a strong government, effective government, keeping workers in their place, and so on. And what I think you have to say is that there is a loss of belief, in a sense, among the real directorates of society in the existing system. I mean, in any case, the parties had changed. The communist parties were changing. They were increasingly, as one writer put it, two-tier bodies. That's to say, the real party was what was sometimes called the nomenklatura, which is, of course, if you like, the East European term for what in the West we tend to call the ruling class. That the people on the lists of names, the jobs for which the party had to approve appointments and so on, the strategic jobs in society and in the economy and in politics. The workers who were members of the communist parties were increasingly an add-on decoration to the party. They were no longer playing the role of mobilizing society, as they did in the 1950s, for example, in quite important ways. And what was apparent from surveys, for example, the Polish party seems to have got very keen on opinion survey, opinion polls. There were official opinion research institutes and so on in Poland. And they surveyed their own members. And they found, when they surveyed their own members, that their members were indistinguishable from the rest of society in terms of their opinions. That half the membership of the Polish United Workers' Party in fact went to Mass every Sunday, or as regularly as the rest of the population did. That 90% of their members in fact listened to Radio Free Europe. And that only 38% of them had any confidence in the Central Committee of the Polish United Workers' Party. And they were slightly more confident, of course, in that respect. They had more confidence in the leadership of the Polish United Workers' Party than did the average citizen. But they weren't that different. The majority didn't have any confidence. So there's this tide of opinion in any case. And a shift, if you like, in opinion and in orientation towards the market and towards the West, in the rulers, amongst the ruling layers. So we come to the question, well, what sort of revolutions were they? I mean, if we could say, well, as some people would want to say, these were shifts from socialism to capitalism. But then you have to ask, well, in what sense? And I don't want, you can answer this for yourself, but in what sense can one talk about the countries of Eastern Europe being socialist? Were they ever socialist in any meaningful sense at all? Was there a shift from dictatorship to freedom, which is a sort of State Department view, if you like, of the changes that occurred in Eastern Europe? Well, certainly there was a shift to parliamentarism, to elected parliamentary government in most of these countries, and I think Romania is a little dubious still in those terms. What did happen was that people won in 1989 important civil and political rights. The right to organise freely in trade unions. For example, the re-legalisation of solidarity. Unions in principle independent of the government. The right of free speech. The right to form your own political parties without hindrance by the state. Those sorts of things. Not freedoms to be sniffed at by any means. They've got some value, obviously. On the other hand, by and large, the same people are still in charge in Eastern Europe. Now, if you go to the court, you'll find the same people as judges and magistrates. You'll find the same people, largely speaking, at the head of the police and the army, and so on. You find the same people, with some exceptions, heading up enterprises and so on. Basically, it's the same ruling class, it seems. I mean, some people at the top have gone, but I'll come back to the significance of that a bit later. In some countries, on the other hand, not all of them, but in some countries, clearly in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia and in Romania, the action of masses of people on the streets was a significant element in the political process of transformation. No question about it. I mean, we all, presumably everybody here must have seen a bit of the TV at that time, the exciting, very moving sight of the people breaking the Berlin Wall, for example, demonstrating in Czechoslovakia, fighting the Securitate in Romania, and so on. Not so much of that, however, in Poland and Hungary, by any means. And between the masses and the governments, there are the leaders. Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa, people of this sort. The New Forum in Germany, the pastors and the peace activists and so on, who comprise the New Forum in Germany. Now, the ideas of those leaders are just worth reflecting on for a moment. The people who became very prominent in some ways in the media. They certainly seem to have accepted the idea that what existed in Eastern Europe was socialism. That effectively, if you like, that, to put it crudely, Stalinism was the same as socialism. And they don't seem to have had, any of them, any vision of popular organisation. And certainly not a popular organisation forming the basis of any kind of new society. They also, I think we have to say, had some of them, considerable illusions in the possibilities of opening up their economies and their societies to the Western model. I mean, Lech Wałęsa initially was saying in 1989, for example, well, we don't have to face the problem of unemployment in Poland. He said there's too much to do. Right? As if unemployment in Britain, for example, is a result of there not being enough to do. You know, as if we've got all the houses we need, that's why our building workers are unemployed, for example, and so on. That's not, looking at the problem of unemployment as if the problem were to be posed to be like in terms of Marxism, in use value terms rather than exchange value terms. In money, as if profitability isn't the criterion which determines whether workers are employed or not whether they're needed for society. Now, of course, he is explains Polish workers we must bow to the International Monetary Fund, to the demands of the Western banks to pay off their interest and so on. We have to pay our way, in other words, accepting the language of capitalism. But the illusions are there initially. And they're significant, they play a significant part in their illusions. Now I think we have to say that if you look, on the one hand you have to say the populations of Eastern Europe have won very significant civil and political rights. On the other hand, they have lost a lot. There's growing unemployment. Unemployment grew from about 10,000 people in Poland at the beginning of 1990 to something like 1.25 million now. And of course, Poland is a country which hasn't even got a very extensive network for dealing with the problem of unemployment. It hasn't got a developed social security system and so on. It's got a rather improvised and patchy social security system. There's a great deal growth of poverty. Social services are in a state of, they were already, of course, not in a good state, now they've collapsed even further. And of course, those same people who were the leaders in 1989 are, largely speaking, explaining to the people now why they must make sacrifices. In other words, they are no longer leading, but they're acting, you might say, against the population. And so you have the situation that someone like Jaruzelski in Poland, the old Communist Party president, in an interview is able to make jokes at Solidarity's expense, which are quite, I mean, he says, I remember that there were strikes for self-management, he says, and we opposed self-management on the grounds it would bring anarchy, but I don't remember any strikes for privatization of industry. And now this government is introducing privatization. Of course, it's quite right. It wasn't part of the demands of Solidarity. Now it is. Now it is. Now, Timothy Garton Ash, in a book which came out a couple of years ago called The Uses of Adversity, which was a series of essays on Eastern Europe, which came out just as these events was, you know, the really exciting events, if you like, or dramatic events were just about to happen. He, in one of his essays, he was talking about Poland and Hungary because those processes were underway. He talked about what was going on as revolutions. I sort of put it, not, you know, with an F rather than a V. In which, because what he could see going on was a process through which, in fact, the old communist regimes were in fact engaging in power-sharing exercises with the opposition. Power-sharing exercises in which, in the end, of course, they lost. They lost out. It wasn't apparent when the processes began that this would happen. But, of course, it's also the case that 1989 turned out to be more than revolution, with an F, a sort of mixture of reform and revolution. There were abrupt changes in East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Romania through popular rebellion. And certainly the whole combination in Eastern Europe of reform from above, which undoubtedly is part of the story, and mobilization from below, pushed the communist parties and pushed those regimes far further than anybody in them had expected when the process began. The regimes were outreached, in a sense, by the events. They were swept aside in the end by the events. Now, come back to the question, what sort of events were there? Well, I think it's useful I'm talking in the seminar before about the different distinctions we can make between different kinds of revolutions. I think the distinction between a social revolution and a political revolution is a useful one. If we treat a social revolution as being one which changes, if you like, the whole system of society, the mode of production, to use the Marxist language, if you like. Whereas a political revolution can involve a change in the political system without changing the form of society very dramatically. And it's a possibly, you know, if you play around with it, you work on this, you'll find, well, there's problems with this, but it's, as a beginning sort of approach to the question, I think it's a possibly useful distinction between social and political revolutions. Now, was there a social revolution in Eastern Europe? I don't think one can make out a case for such a thing, that there was a change in the mode of production, the system of society in Eastern Europe. You see, the idea that there was a restoration of capitalism in Eastern Europe, of course, depends on the idea that in the first place there was some sort of post-capitalist system there, something non-capitalist in Eastern Europe. But if that were the case, there is a problem. Why was the transition so easy? Because it was easy. It wasn't very bloody. I mean, Romania was the exception in Eastern Europe in terms of violence. Most of the events in Eastern Europe were not violent. In Czechoslovakia, nobody died. I don't know whether anybody died in East Germany. I don't think they did. Nobody died in Czechoslovakia. There was a rumour, which was in fact put out by the state, that a student had died on one of the student demonstrations. But in fact, it was not true. Nobody died in Czechoslovakia. There weren't even mass mobilizations in Poland and Hungary. Really, the regimes in Poland and Hungary just petered out in the round table negotiations and what happened afterwards. In Hungary, I mean, from what I've read about Hungary, Garton Ash in his most recent book, which you'll find mentioned on the reading list, he says that he describes the Hungarian event as a media event. Most of the population saw it on television, right? But it wasn't something they participated in. Rather in the same way that I was saying the Czech events in 1968 had an element of that, of the population as an audience of a process rather than being active participants. And if you look at the level of violence in Czechoslovakia, actually, the police violence against the population was less than the level of police violence against the miners in 1984-5 in Britain. I think it was 3 miners died in the miners' strike in Britain. Nobody died in Czechoslovakia in the change of government. And in any case, one of the things which is clear is that sections of the nomenclatura, of the ruling layer, if you like, the ruling class, welcomed the move. They didn't oppose it, they welcomed it. They adjusted very, very easily to it. And the reason they adjusted was because they were already adjusting. I mean, Hungary's elite, for example, had already moved in that direction. There's a nice essay by a man called Hankis, who's an Hungarian sociologist. Oh, I was going to say American. Hungarian sociologist who did a study of the elite in Hungary. And he started by going and looking at the boutiques in the smartest street in Budapest, and traced the family connections of the owners of the boutiques. And then he drew a portrait of, and showed that they were all linked to leading members of the Communist Party, the boutiques. So they were the sons or daughters, and he wrote as follows. He says, he talked about the oligarchic families in Hungary. He wrote as follows. He says, the characteristic oligarchic family in the mid-1980s was a father or grandfather who was a party apparatchik, a high-level party or state official. His son, a manager of a British-Hungarian joint venture. His son-in-law with a boutique in Váci Street. His daughter, an editor for Hungarian television. His nephew studying at Cambridge or Oxford, and his mother-in-law having a small hotel or boarding house on Lake Balaton. In other words, fingers in many pies, and family connections, which help, of course, in terms of, getting licenses and so on and so on, because this is still a state licensed and rationed system, and so on and so on. There was also the case that both in Poland and Hungary, that once the idea of privatization, or marketization, or further space for the private sector was permitted, as in Hungary in the 1970s onwards and in Poland in the 1980s under Jaruzelski, that the heads of industry, the enterprises, would often turn part of their enterprise, and often the most profitable part, into a private enterprise. And there were all sorts of very complicated legal maneuvers which they went through, clever rip-offs. And they became what the Hungarians came to call the Red Barons. And others of them already had all kinds of links with the West through multinational investment, through debt, through all the problems of it. The debt, of course, means that people had to talk to each other. They had to travel around the world. There was a love of foreign currency which developed amongst the top layers in Eastern Europe. They had, of course, the most access to it. When the new Polish foreign minister came into office, the first non-communist one, he did a tour of European Polish embassies in Europe. And he found that they were full of people who had been things like deputy ministers who'd retired, communist deputy ministers who'd retired to become embassy officials abroad because it gave them access to foreign currency, and they were rather put out by the idea that this wasn't the proper perk of the job. And opening politically, in a sense, to the West gave them the opportunity to indulge, in a sense, these propensities which they'd already developed further, and towards the market, towards profitability, towards becoming rich, and so on. And so it seems to me that as Harman's summary phrase, that the societies of Eastern Europe didn't step backwards in 1989, nor did they step forwards, they stepped sideways, seems to me the best way to describe it. There wasn't a social revolution in that sense, that either a new and more superior form of society was introduced, nor was there a step back from a superior to an inferior form of society. Rather, it was a shift from one variant of capitalism to another. Now, in that situation, many of the bosses of Eastern Europe are benefiting from that shift, and quite a few are losing in that situation as well. I wouldn't be the head of an old steelworks in Czechoslovakia for love nor money, basically you're hiding to nothing, unless you make a deal with some Western scrap merchant. The most visible aspect, of course, of what happened in 1989, and the thing which commanded our attention, which filled the screens in a sense, was the collapse of the one-party system. And once they had lost state power, the Communist Party has just faded away. to become either hardly apparent at all, as in Poland, or in some countries actually to win quite a significant minority vote in the elections, 13, 14%, that sort of thing, as a sort of opposition. There were elements of working class opposition, in other words, to unemployment, inflation, and the rest of it, which were expressed through voting communism. But they became minority parties. And they lost their capacity to mobilise their members to a very considerable extent. But I think we need to distinguish, if you like, between class rule and political form. You see, you can have a particular sort of society with a particular kind of class ruling continuously over a whole period of time, while the state changes. And the classic example of this, of course, is Germany. Germany had an extensive capitalist class as a capitalist country with the bourgeoisie. From when? I don't know, sometime in the 19th century, no doubt about it. All through the period of the German Empire, through to 1918, Germany has a capitalist class with an emperor. Then there's the Weimar Republic. There's a change, there's a revolution actually. There was genuinely a revolution in 1918 in Germany. And the state changes, and the parliamentary democracy is introduced, the Weimar Republic comes in, the capitalist class goes sailing on. There's still the same capitalist class. Krups is there always. Right? Siemens electricals are there always. Comes 1933, the Nazis take over. Destruction of parliamentary democracy, destruction of civil rights, the Third Reich. What happens to the capitalist class? It's still there. Different form of state. 1945, the Bundesrepublik. Still there, the capitalist class. The capitalism continues with different forms. I mean, another example, in Spain. The shift from fascism to liberal democracy is not a shift from capitalism to something else, it's a shift within capitalism. Quite dramatic, and of course it's important from the point, if you're an ordinary person in society, it makes a great deal of difference what political regime you're under. I'd much prefer to be under a liberal democratic regime than a fascist regime, of course. I like my right to sit in a lecture and say, talk about capitalism, and so on, and to vote, and to belong to a union, and express daft opinions, and the rest of it freely, well, relatively freely, and so on. Sure, they're very important, but the character of the system is still capitalist. And I think we have to recognise the rulers of these societies in Eastern Europe adjusted to a change. Sometimes it was more dramatic than at other times. But sometimes they even helped the change. I mean, Jaruzelski and Kiszczak, for example, helped the whole thing along. And they were army generals, and they helped the whole thing along. They joined the new government, they helped the new government into office, and so on. In Romania, of course, the army, in fact, helped in the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime. The same bosses are there afterwards, fundamentally. Although the articulation of the ruling class, the mechanism of articulation of the ruling class is no longer the old party system, but something different. Now, these revolutions were not, as somebody said in the seminar, they were not workers' revolutions, in the sense that, I don't mean that workers didn't participate in them, because large numbers of workers did participate as individuals, of course, in the street demonstrations and so on when they occurred. They did vote in the elections and the rest of it. But no autonomous workers' bodies were created. And it seems to me that's a crucial measure of whether you have a working class component to a revolution, whether in fact you see the emergence of specifically working class organisations contesting in a sense for power. I mean, the classic examples being things like Soviets, workers' councils, or I would argue also Solidarity in Poland in 1980, though not later, of course. In that sense, there's no specifically socialist potential, I think one might say, to the events of 1989. There's nothing like, they're not like Hungary in 1956, where the workers' councils emerged. They're not like Poland in 1980, in which the inter-factory strike committees and so on emerged. Solidarity itself in Poland was not what it had been. It had become a pro-market movement. Of course, a movement demanding political emancipation, but attached increasingly to arguments for the market. And increasingly, a movement of intellectuals, of the middle classes. It had lost most of its working class base in practice. Politically, it still articulated the aspirations of the working class base in that people voted solidarity in the 1989 elections. no question. But they didn't join Solidarity as a union, which had 10 million members in 1981. When it became legal again, it had 2 million members. And there were far more members in the new unions which had been created in the period after martial law. And it wasn't the case even that the workers who were in Solidarity unions, in Solidarity as a union, were the most militant workers by any means. Certainly their leaders, as trade union leaders, were amongst the least militant. Most that you would call off strikes. Of course, we must support our government. You know, that classic argument, the argument, say, of right-wing trade union leaders in this country when there's a Labour government. And that, you see, Solidarity had moved, the oppositions had moved, and this was true of the oppositions in Eastern Europe. Not only had the regimes moved towards ideas of the market, so had the oppositions. And Solidarity was a typical example of the evolution of the oppositions in Eastern Europe, away from what in the 1960s and 1970s had been ideas of humanistic Marxism, socialist reform of various kinds. The typical oppositionist by the 1980s was developing towards a position closer to that of John Stuart Mill, if you like. In fact, they were reading in Poland John Stuart Mill in the underground. They were not reading the early works of Marx. They were reading John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville. Liberal works, in other words. They were the things which were being read in underground education circles. And, of course, they were able, therefore, to come to agreements with regimes which were moving in the same direction. They were actually converging towards a rather common view of what the solution to the economic problems of Eastern Europe was, namely a Western market solution. And the other thing I think we might note about the whole process is that actually there was quite a high level of popular passivity. Although, of course, we see the demonstrations in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia and Romania. When it comes to things like the elections, for example, the turnouts were remarkably low. The first free elections in Hungary, and what's the turnout? 60-odd%. The first free elections in Poland. The local elections, 49% in 1990, bothered to turn out. It's like boring old elections in Britain. A large part of the population says, it doesn't seem to be worth it, you know, there seems to be something good on the telly, it's raining, I don't know anything, why should I bother, it's nothing to do with me, I'm not going to bother to vote. And that was, they got 60-odd%, 62% in the key elections, you know, the ones that actually, when Solidarity won, actually participated in the voting at all. In the second ballot, when it was just a runoff between old regime candidates, it was 25% on average, and as low as 5% in some constituencies. There was, therefore, in some ways, the events in Eastern Europe did not involve a great deal of joy. People didn't experience a huge sense of liberation and transformation of their lives in these events, in what I think we could call political revolutions. If you want an analogy, I will offer you the following. You may find it highly objectionable because you love the lady very much, but when Mrs. Thatcher finally fell from office, there was a lot of people, I think, who said, hooray! And then, I don't know, it was a bit disappointing. Nothing much, what really had changed? Okay, she'd gone, but then, you know, I think it was a little bit like that on a grander scale in a lot of these countries. So what has changed? So what's better? What's really different? And so on. You see, there's a change in the political regime, but not in the whole fundamentals of the system. The majority of the population were workers before, and they're still workers. Only now, of course, they face pressures from unemployment, and so on. It wasn't what they actually said. I mean, it's very difficult to know what people set out to achieve in those brief but glorious exercises of street power and the rest of it. You know, the 200,000 people who marched on the Friday evening in Leipzig, saying we are the people, and so on. They weren't marching for unemployment. Let's have lots of unemployment and suffering and poverty. And people don't go out the streets saying, give us unemployment and poverty. And what they got was not what they wanted, however incoherent what they wanted was. That wasn't what was in their minds. What they got was Chancellor Kohl. Well, actually they cheered Chancellor Kohl. in the beginning of 1990 and reviled him at the beginning of 1991. It's a very open situation. I mean, all sorts of possibilities for development now. But they themselves were affected by the claim, which had become the predominant idea amongst the opposition, that the only way forward was to liberal capitalism, to Western capitalism, to a tremendously idealised vision of the market as well. And in practice, the hopes that they have from the market are likely to be dashed. I think we have to be, in that sense, the prospects for Eastern European economic development are very, very poor. Polish exports per head are about 1/5 of the level of Singapore's exports. You want to measure. Another measure, the whole of Eastern Europe, all the countries of Eastern Europe, add up. When you add up all their exports, they amount to 2% of the world's exports. In other words, it's not a terribly important place from the point of view of the heartland of world capitalism. In fact, the whole of Eastern Europe's exports amount to 3/4 of the exports of Hong Kong. And you can walk across Hong Kong, if you walk smartly, I believe, in one day. Hong Kong exports more than the whole of Eastern Europe. And they are not going to attract massive investment. I mean, the likely scenario for Eastern Europe is what? Something like a reformed Latin America. Latin America after demilitarization. After the overthrow of the fall of the military regimes in Latin America. That sort of situation. I mean, not necessarily the same level as, say, the murder of children in the streets of Brazil and that sort of thing. Or necessarily such appalling slums and bidonvilles, but countries racked with debt and austerity and unemployment. That's as likely as a scenario as anything, I think, for the countries of Eastern Europe. Countries with unstable economies and therefore possibly unstable politics, with in some ways, an appalling legacy to overcome, the legacy of the Rust Belt, of the polluted environment, and so on, where 70% of the Czech forests are dying, and the new Czech Ministry of the Environment thinks that 2/3 of all the factories ought to be shut down on health grounds. Now, for a period, those governments, the new governments, after they came into office, those new governments had a honeymoon period. Now, Mazowiecki, the new head of the government, in the early months of 1918, was getting 88% votes in popularity polls in Poland. That's in early 1990. People are being asked in the street, do you approve of Mazowiecki as the Prime Minister? Oh, yes, 88%. He's our Prime Minister, and so on. When it came to the elections in November 1990, he got 18%. The numbers turned around from 81% to 18% in the presidential elections. Why? Because he presided over the growth in unemployment and a rise in poverty in Poland over the previous 12 months. The honeymoon was very short. There have been strikes in Poland, mass demonstrations last year, East Germany celebrated the visit of Chancellor Kohl. This year, huge demonstrations against unemployment in East Germany. That's, if you like, a positive side. There's some very negative phenomena as well, which I think we need to note. The revival of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, of open anti-Semitism. I mean, previously there had been anti-Semitism, but not as overt as now. Written on walls in Poland now, you will see slogans like Jews to the gas chamber in Polish, or Judenraus in German areas. Again, people asking questions in the presidential elections about whether so-and-so was a Jew. There are hardly any Jews in Poland. They were killed by the Nazis. There are hardly any there. There's anti-Gypsyism in Hungary and in Romania. All kinds of recrudescent nationalisms of the most virulent right-wing kind in some places, like in Slovakia, for example, where there was recently a public ceremony to celebrate the bastard who headed the pro-fascist government during the war in Slovakia. It was named after Father Tiso, wasn't it? They had a public opening a memorial to this swine who was killed. It's like putting up a memorial in France to Pétain, or to Lord Haw-Haw in England. So somebody who was just a collaborator with the Nazis. So within the governments, also, what is remarkable is how unstable those new governments have been. They've split. The Czech Forum has split, Solidarity has split. And there, of course, the demonstrations in Bucharest within months of the revolution, the fighting in the streets between where miners were shipped in by the regime to beat up protesting students and so on. Now, what I think we can say is one picture won't do at all what's happening. And just to mention this, that Francis Fukuyama of the American State Department gave a talk in an official American view, if you like, of the events in Eastern Europe, in which he proclaimed the end of ideology, the end of history. We've won, basically, he said. This is it. It's all over. Liberal capitalism now is found. We face a new world of harmony and peace. That was as they were. It was a few months before they set off for Iraq, of course. They killed 200,000 people there. And basically, he proclaimed a new world of peace and prosperity as a result of the defeat of communism in Eastern Europe. And you have to say, well, tell that to the Iraqis, tell that to the Kurds, tell that to millions of people who are facing starvation in Africa, and so on and so on. I mean, I think that if anybody made a witty comment about this circumstance, it is André Gunder Frank. I read something the other day. André Gunder Frank stood up at a conference in New York, apparently, very recently, and said, the Cold War is over, and Japan and Germany won. And that's probably a much more accurate account of what's actually happening, because, of course, the very American economy itself is industrialized, but that takes us beyond what in a sense I think we can say is that looking at things in a larger and global context, is that the post-war bilateral world that was discussed in studies of international relations on, that the conflict between the United States and the USSR dominating the world, that bilateral world has been dissolving, and the collapse of the regimes in Eastern Europe is part of that process of shifting. What it's being replaced with is not necessarily a world of peace and harmony, but if you like, something more like the world at the end of the 19th century, the early years of the 20th century, or the interwar world of a number of competing power centers. It is no longer the case that America has the same hegemony in the world economy that it had at the end of the war in the decades after the last war. Given the rise of Japan, the rise of particularly Germany, but also of Europe more generally, but dominated by increasingly economically by Germany. And in that new world, the East European states will have bit parts, I suspect, and rather miserable bit parts in that new drama. They're not going to be at the centre of political attention in some ways, or economic attention. What's missing, just to end, what's missing in Eastern Europe up to now is any significant left wing. And it's going to be very hard for a left wing to develop in Eastern Europe, given, for a period anyway, it will be hard, because of the history of the term left, in a sense, in Eastern Europe, because terms like socialism and Marxism have been seriously corrupted and become massively unpopular terms. I mean, the fact that what is really the left in Solidarity, or it's a very soggy left and a right-wing left, you centre left if you like, doesn't use the term left but calls itself west of centre rather than left of centre, because the term left will lose its support, is a sign of the difficulties. On the other hand, the scale of the economic and social problems that the population of Eastern Europe are going to be facing offers opportunities for the future for a left to grow. And particularly a left which is clear about what the character of the previous system was, that doesn't see anything socialistic about that previous system, but recognises that it was always a system based on exploitation, class conflict, and so on and so on. And it has to be a left that welcomes what happened in 1989, the fall of the old regimes, and looks to the new situation as one of opportunity. Anyway, I'll stop at that point.